You ready? Okay, good. All right, guys, I want to give you a bit of a flow of the Gemara because I think what's missing is that. So let's just know that the conversation with Rabbi Akiva and Rav Shimon Tamni is one of whether or not you require a weapon for assault or the weapon for murder in the actual court. And both agree that you need the weapon to be of observation to the witnesses at the time of the incident. But in terms of during the court trial, Rabbi Akiva says you can't always recreate that incident. So now we're saying, okay, so what happens if the ox is the weapon? So let me just give you the quick flow. So they inquired, is an assessment performed for damages or an assessment not performed for damages? Do we say that it is for killing that we perform an assessment, determining that through such a blow with an instrument, when the soul leaves the body, then there's an assessment, but with the blow where there's no such thing as the soul leaving the body, but merely gets injured, and for damages, the wound can be attributed to an attack instrument of any size, meaning are they much more discerning in a murder case compared to a case as far as a capital case is concerned? So they're saying, so perhaps there is a difference and perhaps there isn't. So the Gemara is attempting to find a resolution from the Mishnah that we learned in 50b. Okay, so it's it says basically that when you're looking at as far as an ox is concerned, let's just take this. The rabbis taught in a brisa at Tam that ox that killed a person has also inflicted damage. They, the court, tried for the capital case, and they do not try it for the monetary case, obviously, because we learned that you pay for monetary cases that are Tam from half the payment up to a maximum of what the attacking ox is worth. So if the damage is worth 200 zuz, we said you pay 100 zuz. If your scrawny ox attacked the other person's ox, you only give over your ox, and then it's 80 zuz, and the damaged party takes the hit. So if the animal is going to be sentenced to death, you can't use that ox for benefit once it's stoned, and the damaged party gets nothing. As far as the muad ox is concerned, you remembered that killed a person and then inflicted monetary damage. They tried first for the monetary case and then go back and try it for the capital case. If they first tried for the capital case, they don't go back and try it for the monetary case. And we wonder why. Because, the question is, if they first tried it for the capital case, let them go back and try it for the monetary case, because either way it doesn't make a difference, since damages must be paid from the owner's own money. So it doesn't make a difference whether you can use the gufa of the body or not. It's not a tam ox. So Rabbi said, I found the rabbis of the study who were sitting and saying, whom does this brisa accord? It's in accordance with Rav Shimon Hatimni, who says, just as a fist is distinctive in that it is available for the court and for the witnesses to inspect, so too we need an assessment of the court to have the ox come in front of the court to see that that ox in fact could do this right sort of damage. So if the ox was sentenced to death, we don't keep it alive or delay its execution for the sake of performing a court assessment in a monetary case, and we don't delay its judgment. Since we can't assess the ox, this owner can't be made to pay for the damage. So we said, well, we understand with a human, he suffers anxiety if you delay his death, so as not to create him emotional trauma. We carry out the death sentence immediately. Why do we do it with the animal? The animal has no idea it's going to be sentenced to death. We say we learn, Ravad says that we learn the laws of murder cases of humans in relating to murder cases of animals. Just like an animal is put to death for murdering a human, immediately mimics a human being put to death for murdering a human immediately. Sorry, guys, my blood sugar's low, so my tongue's getting a little twisted. Apologies. So either way, we understand that Rabbi Shimon HaTamnini needs the actual ox in the court in order to assess it. Rabbi Akiva says you don't need to, only if the witnesses view the incident, that's good enough. They only have to pass the witness test, to see that they weren't lying. So we're saying, okay, that's fine. But then how can you say that this Brisa follows Rabbi Akiva also? And because he doesn't require an assessment by the court. Why can't we try the mandatory case after the capital case? Why is it that you have to do the mandatory case first? And it's saying here we're dealing with the case where the owner fled. In other words, he absconded. And the Gemara said that you can't have that case, because if the owner fled, then even if they didn't try the ox for the capital case, how can they try it for the mandatory case without the owner present? Meaning it doesn't make a difference which way you hold the trial. If the owner is not present, the trial cannot be held either way. So we're saying, look, at the end of the day, we're talking about the case where the owner was at court, because when his ox killed somebody, they apprehended him, they took him to the court, the owner was present, and the animal was sentenced. And in that particular case, when he realized how much money he owed, the owner fled, but he was there to hear the sentencing, both in the capital case and the financial case. So the Gemara says, but look, in the final analysis, even if the ox is not tried first for the capital case, where will the damaged party be paid? Because if the guy fled, he took his assets with him. So the Gemara is suggesting that what you do is that the owner fled, but he couldn't exactly take his ox with him. Because when he fled, he took a suitcase, and what was he going to do? Put it on the bus or the plane ox? He couldn't. But he took all his other assets, like his banking account details or whatever. So we're suggesting that maybe the owner of the, since the ox was left, that before the ox is put to death, we can get it to work off the debt and then try the capital case second. Once that is done, because we can try the monetary case first, and if the monetary case is tried first, then once the ox has provided working services, then we can try it for the capital case, put it to death, and there's still something to pay the damaged party. So it's saying, well, then why can't the same regulation occur for a tam? In fact, you do the monetary case, you get the ox to do its labor, then you sentence the ox to death, and then the ox is not available for benefit. So we're saying that the problem is that with regards to a tam, the ox's labor is a different category. It's not paying from the gufar of the attacking animal. So it's only okay in a case of muad where the owner absconded. And in that particular case, you could use the ox's labor before it was tried for the capital case to work it off before the ox was sentenced to death. So how do we know this? From Rav Mari, the son of Rav Kahana, who tells us that plowing is considered choice property of the owner, and for a tam, he has to pay from the body of the attacking animal, not his other assets or his other rentable stuff. Now, we're back to the same question. Is there an assessment for damages, or is there not an assessment? What did we say yesterday? We said that we're going to use an example of a bor in the Gemara, of a pit. Traditional pit was round, and we're saying, listen, it doesn't matter if it's a pit, a ditch, an obstruction, anything. Basically, if there's an obstruction, it's a torda, not an av of bor. But if it's an actual pit where there's a sudden drop of height, we're saying that anything up to 10 tefachim deep is sufficient depth to cause injury. And anything 10 tefachim and bigger obligates the digger to pay for the death of the animal, if the animal should die. So the bottom line is, if it's 8 tefach deep, the animal falls in from its neck and then happens to die, the owner of the pit only has to pay the equivalent of damages for whatever would be normal. So it's suggesting then, surely, if it's from 1 tefach to 9 tefach, there's no real assessment for damages, because it all falls under the category of damage, all of it. So therefore, we don't make an assessment for damage. And then Kevin asked that question yesterday, And bottom line is they can work it the other way around. And how does it work the other way around? You can say, well, they don't really do much of a calculation for death. If it drops from 30 tefach and the animal ends up squished, like the hamburger, you pay the same death values if it died from 11 tefach or 10 tefach. There's no assessment made for death either. So we're saying, like, that's not a proof. And more than that, we're saying that there is an assessment for damages. What happens is as follows. There's only two different categories, Kevin. There's a category for injury and a category for death. 1 to 9 tefachim, you pay for injury. Whether the animal dies in it or not, it's just tough luck for the ox's owner. The owner of the pit only has to pay for damage. If it's 10 tefachim or deeper, in that particular case, you would have to pay the value of the dead animal. Okay? Obviously, if the animal miraculously survived, I'm not quite sure what would happen. So that's not a proof that they don't do an assessment for damages, because they work out exactly how badly the animal was damaged. And if they work that out, then it is a proof relatively that there could be an assessment for damage. It just means that it falls under the damage category and not the death category, because it says like this: come learn from the Mishnah. The Torah specifies pit to teetza, just as the standard pit has sufficient depth to cause death, being 10 tefachim deep, so to any excavation that has sufficient depth to cause death obligates the digger. If any of the excavations was less than 10 tefachim deep, and an ox or donkey fell into it and died, the digger is exempt. But if the animal was merely injured by the fall in it, the digger is liable. Now, in stating that the digger is liable for an injury resulting from a pit shallower than 10 tefachim, is it not that the Tana is considering pits from a low depth to a high depth? And this is what he's saying. From a depth of 1 tefach until 10 tefachim, there's no liability for death, but for damages there is liability perhaps. Thus we can see for damages there is liability for any impact. Learn from this that we do not perform an assessment for damages. And the Gemara rejects the proof. It says that's not what the Tana means. We could say he's considering pits from a high depth to a low depth. So if the excavation is any depth up to 10 tefachim, there's liability for death. If there's anything less than 10 tefachim, there's liability for damages and no liability for death. And in reality, I can tell you that there is an assessment performed for damages, and in each and every case, we require an impact strong enough for that property to have been damaged through it. So that's not a proof for or against. You can argue both ways. So because it's inconclusive, the Gemara is looking for another. So this comes to what, Kevin, we were going to do last night, but there was a storm. So come learn a proof from a brisa: if a master struck his slave upon his eye and blinded him, or upon his ear and deafened him, the slave goes out to freedom on account of these actions. If, however, a master struck a wall opposite the slave's eye and the slave no longer sees, or opposite his ear and he no longer hears, the slave does not go out to freedom on account of these actions. Now, what's the reason for the Brisa's Ross ruling? The Gemara says this is not because we require an assessment and we assume that a blow to the wall shouldn't have blinded or deafened the slaves. And accordingly, we can derive from this brisa that there's an assessment for damages. So it's saying that if it wasn't grama, which is causative or indirect, and it was actual direct contact with his body that you slapped or punched him, there is an assessment for damages, and that seems to prove it. Because we learned that a slave does go free instead of this case, which is indirect. So the Gemara says it's not a proof. Why? The reason the slave doesn't go free is because we can say that it was he who sent himself into shock. All it's trying to say there is that that injury itself was so indirect that that couldn't have been enough liability to cause it. So what do we mean shock? If somebody has got a weak heart, and I lose my temper with them and I throw a brick at their foot. Okay, Levi throws a brick at Shimon's foot. And Shimon dies because he gets a heart attack from the bodily shock. can't be tried for murder because that is not an impact to create anything more than a broken toe. Even if the person did lose their life, they might have had a weak heart. So that is enough for an injury case, but not a murder case. So in this case, it doesn't prove one way or the other. But the Brisa does say that if you actually startle your fellow or create some sort of shock or indirect impact that shouldn't have resulted in that injury but did, he is exempt under the laws of man, but liable under the laws of heaven, which means that the court can't compel him to pay damages, but he'll be punished by God for his deed unless he compensates the victim. So we're saying that we learned that in the 5th daf of Bava Kamma, that basically you can't force the person to pay, but Hashem will hold his soul responsible if he doesn't. So he should make restitution. And the Gemara says if he shouted into another's ear and deafened him, he is exempt from the liability under the laws of man. Why? Because it's not considered a direct assault, okay? But if he grabbed him and then shouted into his ear and deafened him, he is liable. So it seems to be there that if you grab the other person physically, that transforms the action into assault action, even if it's merely groma, indirect or causative as opposed to direct damage. So the moral of the story is you can't put your hands on somebody. That's it. Now, the Gemara is trying to learn a resolution because now we're trying to find out if there is an assessment for damages or not. So this is inconsistent. So you've got to learn a proof from a brisa regarding the 5 things. What is the 5 things? We learned, guys, it's categories of compensation payable to a victim injured by another person. So we assess the victim and give him the money immediately. So the assailant has to pay his victim immediately upon conclusion of the trial. Just like for a murder trial, the assailant gets the death penalty immediately. The victim here gets paid immediately upon conclusion. But there's only certain payments you can make immediately. Guys, what do you think it is? There are 5 things. What are the 5 things, Arthur? Okay, forget about it. Kevin, what are the 5 things?
The 5 categories of injuries. Loss of earnings.
Yes.
Loss of prestige, like humiliation in the community. Obviously injury.
Yeah.
Did I say that?
You didn't
potential future earnings.
Yes.
And if someone's a breadwinner, I can't think of it. I don't know.
Pain.
Exactly.
Pain and suffering.
So the first thing is nezek, it's actual damage. The second thing it's sar, it's pain. The third thing is shevet, recuperation and healing. Well, actually, the third thing is medical bills. The fourth thing is shevet, it's the recovery time. And that recovery time is paid at the new wage that he'd earn with his current incapacitation if it's permanent liability. The amount he lost in terms of future earnings, that's paid under the category of nezek. So we learned that if it's a temporary injury, the medical bills will be higher generally, but the capital amount that he accrued by not being able to work his position would be lower. Whereas if it's a permanent injury, and then the shevet period would be lower. Whereas if it's a permanent injury, that's under the category of nezek. But Kevin is absolutely compensated from what he was capable of doing, what he's able to do now. Shevet is the recuperation period of paying him his rate as a field cucumber watch or something in his new capacity of limitation for that recovery rate. So that's a different thing, and humiliation. So you covered all the grounds, guys.
And,
yeah.
They pay the guy, injured party, regardless if he recovers in a quicker time than anticipated. He still gets the money. There's no they don't.
There's no deductions. Excellent. You learned that well. That's exactly it.
I remembered something.
You remembered a lot. So what can you pay immediately, guys, out of those 5 categories? Think about it.
I think you got to pay immediately for the actual that first one. What's it called?
Nezek.
The actual damage.
Nezek.
Yes, absolutely. That's correct. You pay for actual damage immediately. And that also means that if there's a permanent maiming, you pay all future earnings because that's calculable immediately. You say, well, what happens if we don't know? So if we don't know, we pay what we do know immediately. In other words, if a guy's got an arm missing, he's no longer going to be a scrub, is he? So, but if it's a question mark, Gavin, that we don't pay until it's an assessment in terms of temporary to permanent disability. But we pay for Nezek, the actual damage. We pay for what else do you think? Does the guy experience pain immediately, yes or no?
Depends what type of injury it is.
Well,
Yeah.
I would think yes. I would think
If the ox goes and gores him with the horns,
can
yes,
linger.
So the moment the injury occurs is when you start feeling pain. You don't feel pain at the time of trial. You feel pain immediately. So that pain amount is worked out and the person is paid immediately after the trial. In terms of how do you calculate how long pain is going to last for, there's obviously a calculated sliding scale, but you don't delay that payment under the guise of saying, well, we'll pay him until he's free from pain, because you can work out what an injury like that would take. So that's paid immediately. And then humiliation is paid immediately. You can work out what the humiliation factor is pretty much immediately. The two things you cannot pay for is what, guys?
Is loss of standing in the community, loss of prestige, or because that's
No. Humiliation is paid for.
Okay, but how do you calculate?
Up front, but what is delayed? Well, how do you know what the medical bills are going to cost you? So you don't. So there are two different opinions in the Gemara. The one opinion is you pay as and when the fees come up, but the other issue is that loss of employment is also paid over a period of time. So what we're saying is actual damages is paid immediately. Pain is paid immediately because it's suffered from the victim the minute he's injured, and humiliation, it's calculated and paid immediately. Now, this particular brisa is saying that loss of employment in the person's new capacity, we don't know how long that would be. So we would pay it according to monitoring the person and healing as well. We don't know how much the medical bills are going to pay because the sums are not yet known and are calculated based on the victim's projected needs until he recovers, okay? Now, there is an issue. Why? Because if they assessed him, but he progressively deteriorated. In other words, the recovery took longer than expected, so that the expenses were greater than that was assessed. Give him only that which he was assessed. In other words, if you have a look here, is that we assume that it, in a certain case, as we learned from before, that it could have been the victim's negligence. When we looked at the 85th duff and the 83rd duff, that could have delayed that sort of recovery to a certain degree. Okay, so if that occurs, then we give him only that which was assessed. Then this price is saying if they assessed him and he healed faster than expected, which is exactly what Kevin said, they give him the entire amount for which they assessed him. Why? Because they say that he recovered earlier because Hashem had mercy on the victim. But if that was the general consensus in terms of the recovery time, he can keep the difference. Kevin is exactly right. But if he healed slower than expected, and they did an accurate sum based on previous case studies, then we feel on a certain level he was negligent, and therefore we don't pay more than we originally assessed it because we used common probability and statistics of previous cases. Now, this seems to contradict another brisa. Why? Because if you remember, there was a brisa that in the 83rd daf that basically if source developed from the injury, the assailant must keep paying the additional expenses of the healing. So it would seem to contradict this, but Tosfot had an answer and said that basically, if there was no initial assessment, for whatever reason, that they weren't sure how this person would heal up, the assailant must pay all expenses as and when they come up. But if the assessment was done in advance and all the payments were made on time, exactly as calculated with the general recovery, then that would suffice. Okay. So also infection, there's a discussion by Tosfot as to whether or not infection is included, and he said it's not. If an infection sets in, that's also from the assailant to pay, because the infection would never set him if he never assaulted him. So why are we trying to learn about this entire thing? It's because it says if we're learning about damage assessments, this is actually a proof that there's an assessment performed for damages. So the Gemara says, listen, this is an irrelevant case. Why? Because this is a case, guys, of assessing the person to see how long he's going to be incapacitated from the injury and how long he won't be incapacitated. So we've got no question that there's an assessment as far as the person's recovery is concerned. But up until now, we've been talking about assessing the instrument that caused the damage, the weapon. So that has nothing to do with assessing for injury. They're two separate issues. Just because it's under the category of assessment, there was never a problem with assessing and paying for injury. But you can't pay for injuries if your weapon didn't cause it. So the first thing you've got to determine is, did that weapon kill? Did that weapon injure? For killing, you do an assessment. For damages, we're not sure. And that's the issue at hand in terms of the weapon. Obviously, once it proved that the weapon caused it, then there's no doubt that the victim has to be assessed in terms of his recovery. Okay? So what's the law as far as this is concerned? Okay? Come learn the answer from the Brisa. Rav Shimon Hatimni says, just as a fist is distinctive in that it's available for inspection to both the court and witnesses, so to any assault case can be judged only if the weapon used to inflict the injury is distinctive in that it's available for inspection to both the court and witnesses. Learn from this that there's an assessment performed for damages. Gemara says, indeed, learn from this. So it doesn't matter whether you learn from Rabbi Akiva, where the halacha comes, or reading the Brisa from Rav Shimon HaTimni. The bottom line is both agree there's an assessment for damages. The only difference is Rabbi Akiva says that it's good enough for the witnesses to have assessed the weapon or viewed the weapon. It doesn't have to be the court as well. So this is a proof that there is an assessment for the weapon. And obviously, assessment for recovery was never in question. All right, Kevin, can you teach us?
Yeah. Okay. Continue where we left off about doubting tzaddikim. Okay, where were we? Yeah. Okay, so it says here, and distancing oneself from a false word. So it says here. It is permissible for a person to adjust the truth for the sake of peace, or shalom. And in Bereshit, chapter 50, verse 16, it's talking about the story of Joseph. It says, your father gave orders, thus shall you say to Yosef, kindly forgive the spiteful deed of your brothers. Rav Nosson insists that this is not permissible, but actually a moral obligation to bend the truth in order to save a life. And Shmuel says, how can I go? If Shaul finds out, he will kill me. So Hashem said, take a heifer and say, I have come to bring an offering to Hashem. I assume a red heifer. I wonder. Anyway. The Tana Devei Ishmael taught, great is peace. Even Hashem made a change. First it is written, my husband is old. But when relaying Sarah's words to Abraham, Hashem quoted her as saying, though I have aged. Similarly, the Gemara in Masechet Kesubot 17a says that it is permissible, even laudable, to praise a bride in front of the groom, even if the words are somewhat exaggerated. The Gemara in Bava Kamma 23b presents 3 specific instances in which Torah sages prefer to hide or adjust the truth to understate one's knowledge or expertise, to remain silent and discreet on private issues, and in extreme cases not to praise one's hosts, lest they are inundated with hospitality requests which they are incapable of meeting. Okay, nonetheless, the Torah demands that one distances himself from falsehood, so that even when it's permissible to conceal the truth or stretch it, one needs to do so reluctantly while gritting one's teeth. The Gemara in Masechet Yevamot 63a warns against the habit of lying, even for a good reason, relating the following anecdote. Rav's wife was causing him distress. When Rav asked her, "Make me lentils," she prepared him legumes. When he asked her for legumes, she prepared lentils. When his son Chia grew up, he would reverse the instructions. If his father said to him that he wanted lentils, he would tell his mother that his father requested legumes. And if he asked for legumes, he would tell his mother that his father wanted lentils. In this way, Rav's desire was fulfilled. Rav commented to his son, "Your mother is now good to me and does whatever I ask." Rav Chia then told his father that he had reversed the instructions to his mother. Rav said to him, "This is an example of a popular idiom. The child that comes from you teaches you wisdom and does what you were supposed to do. However, my son did not do this, since it is a lie, as it is written in Yirmiyahu, they train their tongue to speak falsehood." Let's continue. I see we've got a minute. Let me continue. Explaining why Rav chose to quote from Yirmiyahu and not the verse, "Distance yourself from a false word," the Maharsha writes that Rav wanted to teach his son an important lesson. As much as he enjoyed his son's wisdom, Rav asked his son to stop tricking his mother so that he would not habituate himself to corrupt the truth. If a person becomes accustomed to lie or bend the truth, his moral sensitivity is dulled, and his discomfort with falsehood gradually dissipates. Aramaic translation of the word train in the above word is ilfu, which connotes the double meaning to teach and to train and exercise, as in physical therapy. The Torah expects a person to have innate revulsion to falsehood, presume that people would find it physically and psychologically difficult, not unlike any physical activity to which they are not accustomed. Such physiological difficulties are discernible by lie detecting machines. However, people who habitually lie minimize their physiological reactions and can thus circumvent the detection of these machines.